Hey guys, this is Thomas over here at nursemoneytalk.com. When you're applying for a nursing job, there are some things you need to watch out for. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about 10 of my top red flags that if you're applying for a job, whether you see it in an interview or just talking to like a nurse recruiter, that really should have you take a step back and try to find out more information. If you notice any of these things, it doesn't necessarily mean you should run as fast as you can, though sometimes it really does mean you should run as fast as you can. However, for many of them, it's really more of a you should ask more questions and find out more information, because many times these red flags show up as a symptom of some bigger issue. The first one I'm going to start off with, and this is going to surprise many of you because most of the time it's seen as a good thing, but it can lead to a lot of headaches. And that's huge sign-on bonuses. When you apply for a position or see one offering a huge sign-on bonus, it can be enticing. In some ways, sign-on bonuses, especially in nursing, can provide stability. They can lock in a staff to a position, which of course would decrease turnover and can increase stability. And if it's a place you actually want to be at, a sign-on bonus is pretty nice because it's essentially like gravy on top. You get to be at a place you really want to be at and you get more money. However, this can be a red flag because when you see a significantly large sign-on bonus, larger than what you would typically expect for a position like that in the area you're in, it can often lead to it being a red flag because, in general, companies aren't offering more money for goodwill, right? Just for charity. No, they're not. A huge sign-on bonus is usually an indication that there's a reason why they're having to offer it, because they're having a hard time recruiting, and it can mean that it's an undesirable position for whatever the reason might be. And I've discussed about sign-on bonuses in previous videos and articles, which I'll link to those in the description, and you'll also see it show up top, because overall, when it comes to sign-on bonuses, you really need to think about it a little bit more before you sign, because getting out of sign-on bonuses can at times be a little complicated and can lead to undesired consequences, especially if you didn't really read the contract all the way through. Another red flag would be poor benefits. This encompasses a lot of different things. I've said before on numerous occasions, guys, you're not working as a charity. You're not working for free. Healthcare is a business. Everyone else is thinking about money and the benefits they're receiving. And so honestly, you have to be thinking like that too. You have a family to take care of, dependents and whatnot. And so you have to be in that right mindset. Poor benefits can often indicate that companies either do not value their staff or are trying to cut corners. Poor benefits could be all encompassing. It could mean health insurance that's terrible, pay that just sucks, or a retirement plan that's not very good. Another deceptive aspect could be benefits that take an unusually long time to access, which could be kind of weird. And while I'm on this, let me just also point out something. Benefits are only valuable if you are actually going to use it. Companies will try to throw in all sorts of things into their compensation package, but it doesn't matter if you're not going to use them. For example, if part of their compensation package includes really good daycare reimbursement, heck, maybe they're paying 100% of daycare, but you don't have kids or don't plan to use daycare, that benefit is of no value to you whatsoever. So these are all the things that you have to keep in mind when you're evaluating a job offer. Another big red flag is when you're coming to a department, unit, facility, or hospital system with high staff turnover. Now, let me clarify something here. When I say high staff turnover, I'm not just talking about nursing turnover. I know this is a nursing channel and I'm a nurse, and so you might think that's what I mean. But no, I'm talking about all staff turnover. And there's a reason for that. Look, it's a given that high nursing turnover is a massive red flag. If a place is constantly hiring and burning through nurses like there's no tomorrow, with a revolving door of staff coming and going, That's obviously a nightmare situation, and I hope I don't need to tell you that working for a company like that is going to be miserable. But what I don't hear many people talk about is high turnover among other staff members. As a nurse, you're like a middleman or middlewoman to all these other multidisciplinary groups. If there's a high turnover in any of these groups, you're dealing with it. It can make your life absolutely miserable. I've seen this happen with custodial staff, for instance, when they're constantly changing, things don't get cleaned properly. Can you imagine working in a medical facility where cleanliness is compromised? It's not just difficult, it's downright disgusting and potentially dangerous. Another big thing I look for in terms of consistency is what nursing school would call your unlicensed assistive personnel. Guys, your nurse aides, your techs, your medical assistants, and other staff that you as a nurse will be relying on heavily. Based on my experience, high turnover in these positions is probably the hardest to deal with. I've said it before and I'll say it again. A good nurse aide can make your life as a nurse so much easier. So when there's constant turnover in these positions, it just makes life miserable. Real quick before I keep going, if you are finding this video helpful, I would really appreciate the thumbs up. It really does help us in terms of growing the channel and showing the algorithm that you are finding this video helpful so that it will recommend it to more people. Thank you so much for your support. Let's get back to the content. The next red flag to watch out for is when the new hire orientation is poor, inadequate, or non-existent. This applies to all nurses, not just new graduates. Though, let's start with them for a moment. Any employer hiring a new grad nurse knows, or at least should know, that extra training and handholding will be necessary. It's just the nature of the job. If you're a new grad, you need to be asking specific questions about the orientation process. Do you have a new hire orientation? What are the expectations? How long is the orientation? Who will I be working with? How is the orientation structured? They should be able to give you clear, detailed answers that really make sense. For example, if the typical orientation for that position for a new nurse is 3 months, but they're only offering a couple of weeks or a month, that's a red flag. That warrants further investigation. Even if you're an experienced nurse coming into a new unit or department, whether it's in a specialty you've worked in before or one that's entirely new to you, there's going to be a learning curve. Of course, your learning curve as an experienced nurse will be different from a brand new nurse, but you should still receive a reasonable orientation compared to what's standard for that specialty. Keep in mind that some departments will throw you in with little to no orientation if you let them. I've seen it happen, and it can be a nightmare. You really have to be careful and make sure you are advocating for yourself. Another significant red flag is working for a place with a poor reputation. If nurses are constantly complaining about a particular workplace, there's probably a good reason for it. And to be clear, when I say poor reputation, I'm not talking about isolated incidents where 1 or 2 people have negative experiences. I'm referring to where it's commonly known in your area that a certain place is terrible to work at. If a place has a bad reputation, it's usually for a reason. This doesn't mean you should automatically rule out working there, but it does mean you should proceed with caution and do your due diligence. It's worth trying to talk to more people about it, especially if you can find someone who has worked there recently. Sometimes a reputation can linger even after problems have been resolved, which is why I still think you should take note of a poor reputation, but it also warrants further investigation in these cases. It's important to, 1, seek out multiple opinions, not just 1 or 2. 2, try to find recent experiences, not just old stories. 3, look for patterns in the complaints or issues raised. 4, consider if the issues mentioned are deal breakers for you personally. And 5, if possible, speak to current employees to get a sense of the present work environment. Another red flag to keep in mind is when an employer won't allow you to shadow or doesn't offer the opportunity to do so. This can manifest in different ways, such as manager who won't take you around the facility during the hiring process, show you the unit, or let you talk to some of the current staff. I'm always skeptical of a manager who doesn't offer this opportunity because it might indicate that they're trying to hide something about the work environment, especially since if done right, this actually benefits the employer as well as you, the job applicant. Here's how. For you, the potential employee, you can see what a typical day is like. You can assess if this is really what you want. You can observe the personality of the staff, the camaraderie, and physician-nurse interactions. And lastly, you can determine if you feel confident in that work environment. For the hiring manager, especially one who works at a place that's in high demand and they have options, they can see how comfortable you are in the environment. It saves time in the long run because recruiting, hiring, and training is expensive. So it allows them to see if you are a good fit before they actually hire you. Because remember, they want you to stay around. It's expensive for them and it's time consuming with resources for them to go out and rehire people. And then also, they can usually get feedback from the current staff that you talk to for them to get a feel about if they feel like you would fit in with their, hopefully, with their good culture, with their good work environment, if they have one. So if they're not eager to let you shadow or see the unit in action, it could be because they have something to hide. They might not want you to see what it's really like because that could potentially scare you away. This reluctance is definitely a reason to be cautious and perhaps to ask more questions. This next red flag might be a bit controversial depending on your background and current situation, but I consider it a big red flag if there is a high ratio of non-full-time nurses. By this, I mean if there are more per diem, contract, travel, or part-time nurses than full-time nurses. To be clear, this information might be hard to uncover, but if you do find out that there's a high number of non-full-time nurses, I think that's a red flag for several reasons. First, companies generally prefer full-time staff because even with benefits, full-time employees are often cheaper than contract staff. Contract staffing can be expensive due to constant onboarding of new people, and it's generally cheaper in the long run to train employees who stay long-term. Moreover, for staffing consistency, companies usually want full-time staff. For all those reasons, it begs the question then, if they don't have full-time staff, why is that? Is there something wrong with the unit or department that causes a constant turnover of new hires? Here's the other thing too. Based on my experience, non-full-time workers generally don't care as much about their workplace compared to full-time staff. This isn't meant to condemn all non-full-time workers, but typically, if a job is your full-time gig and you're there 40 plus hours a week, you tend to treat that workplace and your colleagues differently. You have a vested interest in taking care of that environment and being cordial to everyone because you know you'll be there a lot and you'll be working with them regularly. It's almost like a second home, and you're more likely to take ownership of your work environment. In contrast, contract and part-time staff may not hold the same level of regard for the workplace. They might not necessarily treat it poorly, but they don't take as much ownership. For example, if you're on an 8 or 12-week contract and you know you'll be moving on soon, your level of investment is different. Similarly, if you have a full-time job elsewhere and only work 1, 2, or 3 shifts a month at a current place, it doesn't feel like your work home, so you're going to treat it differently. You're not going to care as much. For example, in my current role, I've noticed consistently that full-time staff take more ownership of what happens around the clinic. They gather and address issues because they're there for 40 plus hours a week, and they care what happens because they're there a lot. Really, this level of commitment and care is something you really need to consider when you're evaluating a potential employer. Another red flag is when a company frequently uses the phrase, "We are a family here." This phrase makes me feel uncomfortable and somewhat annoyed because in my experience, it's often a way to convince employees to give a greater degree of devotion to the company than the company is willing to reciprocate. Think about the notion of a family. You're willing to give a lot to your family without expecting anything in return. If a family member is hurt, you drop what you're doing to help them. If they're in dire straits, you give them what you can. You don't value your family based on what they give you in return, and you certainly don't leave your family for another because they have more to offer. This is where I start to get uncomfortable because companies using the family slogan often try to convince you to work long hours, weekends, or extra shifts with little notice and to care more about being at work than about the compensation you receive. However, in my experience, this sentiment is rarely reciprocated by the employer. Employers generally do not treat employees as family. If a family member is sick, you don't tell them they're letting everyone down and dock their pay. If a family isn't making enough money, it doesn't start cutting members out akin to companies laying people off. For example, I've seen companies lay off employees who doing good jobs simply due to some financial situation. And they often do this without any heads up. One day you show up and you're told you no longer have a job. Moreover, if a family member has personal problems, the family doesn't fire them and replace them with someone else. Instead, they support them through their issues. The family slogan in the workplace often seems like a one-sided tactic to encourage employees to give more of themselves without any real commitment from the employer. It feels more like an exploitation, if you will, of the emotional connection and loyalty associated with family without offering the same level of support and security in return. And some of you might feel differently, and for good reason. There are exceptions to this rule. So if you have a different perspective, please share it in the comments. However, based on my experience and the stories I've heard from other nurses, the work environment feels different. Unlike a normal family, your relationship in this context is transactional. You do your job and you get paid for it. If you start performing your job, you're replaced by someone who can. I'm not even suggesting that this transactional relationship is inherently bad. I'm just wary of anyone who claims that it isn't a transactional relationship. The second to last red flag I want to point out is encountering vague responsibilities or unrealistic expectations. During the interview process, if you ask about your responsibilities and duties and receive vague responses, that's a significant red flag. You should have clear and specific answers about what your job entails and what is expected of you. In nursing, unlike some other professions, you might not have a rigid contract per se outlining every detail of your role. However, it's still crucial to have clarity on your job duties and expectations. If the responses are vague, it's a warning sign that the employer might not have a clear structure or could be setting you up for unrealistic expectations. Clear job duties and realistic expectations are essential because they allow you to gauge whether the role is manageable and if it aligns with your skills and career goals. Companies that provide vague descriptions might be those that hire quickly, burn out their staff, and then rinse and repeat the cycle. Real quick, if you are a new nurse, make sure to check out the New Nurse Academy by going to nursemoneytalk.com/New Nurse Academy. Link will be on the screen and it will also be in the descriptions below. Now let's get back to the content. The final red flag I want to discuss is when your gut tells you something is wrong. This might sound vague and not very concrete, but it's essential to pay attention to your instincts. As you go through the hiring process, whether you're on a tour, talking to a recruiter, or meeting with a hiring manager, sometimes you'll get a feeling that something is off. This feeling can be hard to quantify. Maybe the nurse manager's answers seem vague, or something about their demeanor feels insincere. Perhaps as you walk around the facility, there's a vibe from the staff that makes you uncomfortable. Your gut might be picking up on subtle cues that something isn't quite right or genuine. If you have a strong history of your gut feelings, being accurate. It's worth considering this instinct seriously. It might not necessarily mean you should turn down the position outright, but it should prompt you to ask more questions and dig deeper to ensure you understand fully what you're getting into. With all that said, I just want to remind you not to let your enthusiasm about a job cloud your judgment. Don't be so eager for a position that you overlook these red flags. It's important to ask questions during the interview process and investigate the unit culture. If possible, inquire about team dynamics, support systems, and how communication works within the unit. Be observant during the interview process for any red flags. If you get a chance to tour the facility, definitely take it and pay attention to what you see. Observe how the nurses interact with one another as well as with other staff members like the ancillary staff and techs. Notice the interaction with physicians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. What is the overall vibe of the unit? Try to pay attention to these things. While most of the red flags I mentioned might not be complete deal breakers, they should at least prompt you to ask more questions and flesh out more details. Thank you so much for watching. And don't forget, if you would like to find nursing jobs, check out the job board at nursemoneytalk.com/jobs.